3 weeks into my first deployment aboard the ISV Basalt Throne, I learned the one lesson the Academy never put into words. They taught ballistics, orbital mechanics, electronic warfare doctrine, fleet communications protocol. They taught me how to read a tactical display and how to die at my post if that's what the situation required. What no instructor ever mentioned, what I suspect they couldn't articulate even if you pressed them, was that silence could be a weapon heavier than any gun in the Terran inventory. I was 23 years old, Ensign Torin Vasek, junior tactical analyst, posted to Sensor Pit 2 on the portside tactical deck of a warship I hadn't yet learned to love. I'd graduated from the Fleet Academy on Ganymede 4 months earlier, 17th in a class of 208, with a specialization in passive sensor analysis, and a minor in xenobehavioral modeling that I'd chosen mostly because the elective fit my schedule. I had never served on a combat vessel. I had never been outside the Sol system. I had never, in my entire brief career, been in a situation where the textbook answers didn't apply. The assignment was a survey patrol in the outer reaches, catalog stellar drift, map gravitational anomalies, update navigation charts for future fleet movements. Routine duty. The kind of deployment they hand to new officers because nothing is supposed to happen out there. My mother, who had served 26 years in the fleet and retired as a commander, told me before I shipped out that first deployments were either uneventful or career-defining, and that you never knew which until it was too late to prepare. I remember thinking she was being dramatic. The Basalt Throne was a Rampart-class dreadnought, and I want to be precise about what that means, because the word dreadnought conjures different images for different people. She was 2.7 kilometers stem to stern, built like a slab of granite someone had chiseled into the rough shape of a warship, and then decided not to smooth over. Blocky, angular. Her hull was all flat planes and hard edges, armor plating layered 3 meters deep in places, lapping over gun emplacements and sensor housings like geological strata. No curves anywhere except where the engineering section bulged slightly to accommodate the 4 main drives. She wasn't elegant. She wasn't fast. She wasn't the kind of ship you'd put on a recruiting poster or name a scholarship after. She was the kind of ship you'd build if your only question was, can this hold a piece of space and never give it up? The answer for a Rampart class was yes. We'd been running dark for 8 days in the gravitational shadow of a gas giant designated Thessaly 7. It was a rust-colored monster 300,000 kilometers across, banded in ammonia storms the color of dried blood, lit from below by a distant G-type star that gave the planet's upper atmosphere an oily amber glow. Running dark meant everything silent. No active sensors, no transponder beacon, no communications relay, no navigational corrections, no waste heat venting except through the passive radiators on the ventral hull. Electromagnetically, the Basalt Throne was a hole in space. To anyone scanning the system, she was another chunk of nickel iron debris drifting in the giant's well. The gas giant's radiation belts helped. Thessaly 7's magnetosphere put out enough electromagnetic noise to mask a small city, and the ammonia storms threw off thermal interference across every band that mattered. We were camouflaged in the planet's own noise, a stone on a riverbed, invisible as long as we stayed still. It was monotonous, the deep, seeping kind of monotony that gets into the walls and the recycled air and the way people talk to each other. 8 days of darkness, 8 days of cold coffee and whispered conversations, and the low thrum of life support running at minimum. The corridors were dim, emergency lighting only, amber strips along the deck plates that turned everyone's face the same tired orange. The crew moved through the ship in soft boots, keeping their voices down, as if the vacuum outside could hear them. Meals were eaten in near silence in the mess hall, the clatter of utensils against trays sounding louder than it had any right to. People read. People slept. People stared at bulkheads and thought about whatever people think about when they've been sealed inside a dark metal box for a week. The ship's interior matched her exterior. Functional, unadorned, built for endurance rather than comfort. The corridors were wide enough for damage control teams to run through in full gear, and the walls were bare composite plating, gray-green, with cable runs and conduit trunks visible overhead. There were no windows anywhere on a Rampart class. The hull armor was too thick, and the only natural light came from the holographic displays in the tactical spaces, which cast a dim blue glow that made everyone look slightly unwell. I spent most of my off-watch hours in the small common area near Sensor Pit 2, reading intelligence briefings on my datapad and drinking the ship's coffee, which was terrible in the specific way that fleet coffee is always terrible. Too hot, too strong, and made by a machine that hadn't been serviced since before I was born. Chief Petty Officer Rin Talsi ran Sensor Pit 2. She'd been in the fleet 22 years, and she treated the boredom as a professional obligation, the same way she treated everything else, with a dry competence that left no room for complaint. During the quiet watches, she'd lean back in her chair, boots up on the console housing, reading technical manuals on passive spectrographic analysis. She never looked worried. I later realized that was because she'd done this before: the waiting, the silence, the long dark, and she understood what it was for. I didn't, not then. There were 4 of us in the pit: Talsi, myself, Petty Officer Den Crossley on the secondary array, and Analyst First Class Juna Markov on signal processing. Crossley was 40, stocky, a lifer who'd served on 6 ships and claimed to have slept through a reactor alarm on the INS Carrick Point. Markov was 28, quiet, precise, the kind of technician who aligned her coffee cup parallel to the edge of her console every time she set it down. They were good at their jobs. They were also, like me, waiting for something to happen in a system where nothing was supposed to. On the 9th day, at 3:47 local ship time, something happened. The passive sensor array on the dorsal spine, a 60-meter antenna farm designed to listen without broadcasting, picked up a gravitational perturbation. A tremor in local space-time, sharp and unmistakable, the kind of signature that only one phenomenon produces: faster-than-light translation. Something had entered the system. I saw it first because I was the one on watch. The waveform scrolled across my display, a compressed spike in the gravitational background, duration 6.3 seconds, bearing 174 Mark 029 relative to our position. I tagged it, time-stamped it, and opened the hardline channel to the Tactical Operations Center 2 decks above. Sensor 2 to TOC. FTL signature bearing 174 Mark 029. Single translation event. Duration 6.3 seconds. Lieutenant Commander Hale's voice came back flat and professional. Copy, Sensor 2, characterize. I ran the return through the classification filter. The gravitational afterimage was dissipating, but its shape told me enough. High mass translation, significant tonnage, estimate carrier equivalent or above. There was a pause, 3 seconds, maybe 4, long enough to notice. Then Hale said, "Hold on, Sensor 2. I held. Beside me, Crossley was already pulling up the raw data on his secondary display, running his own analysis without being asked. He glanced at me, said nothing, and went back to his numbers. 30 seconds later, Chief Talsi was on her feet, boots on the deck, technical manual abandoned on her chair. She crossed the pit in 3 strides, pulled up my returns on the secondary display, and ran her own characterization. Her face didn't change. She picked up the hardline to TOC. Talsi, Sensor 2, correction on the previous report. That was not a single ship. That's a fleet translation, multiple individual mass signatures arriving on a single vector. I'm seeing gravitational residuals consistent with 40+ discrete contacts. Tonnage spread from frigate equivalent to command hull equivalent. They came in together. The bridge didn't reply for almost a full minute. When they did, it wasn't Hale. Sensor 2, this is Captain Lear. His voice was the same as it always was, unhurried, deliberate, like a man placing stones into a dry stack wall. Confirmed. Maintain passive watch. Full log on all contacts. Do not go active. Do not transmit on any frequency. Acknowledge. Acknowledged, Captain. Passive watch, full log, no active, no transmit. Good. A pause. Wake your relief crew. I want Pit 2 at full manning in 10 minutes. I looked at Talcy. She was already reaching for the intercom to wake Markov, who'd gone off watch 2 hours ago. Chief, I said, 40 ships, do we know who? We will, she said, but I'll bet you 3 months' pay I already know. Within the hour, everyone on the tactical deck knew. The Vraxen. I knew the name. Every officer posted to the outer reaches knew the name, the way every sailor knows the name of the reef that sinks ships. The Vraxen were one of 3 spacefaring civilizations whose territory bordered the outer reaches, and they were the intelligence briefings printed in bold. The files described them as a predator-evolved species, and not in the loose, metaphorical way that humans are sometimes called predators, because our ancestors hunted game on the African savanna. The Vraxen were obligate apex carnivores. Their evolutionary lineage ran back through 300 million years of unbroken predatory dominance on a high-gravity world called Vraxis-Core. 6-limbed. Tall, 3 meters at the shoulder in their resting posture, closer to 4 when they extended to full height. Natural chitinous plating along the dorsal ridge in forelimbs, vestigial in some bloodlines, thick as ship armor in others. Wide-set eyes with horizontal pupils, optimized not for color or detail, but for detecting lateral movement across open terrain. The eyes of a species that had spent geological ages spotting prey at distance and running it down. They thought in packs. Their entire social architecture was built on the hunt. The fleet commander was the prime alpha, not elected, not appointed through seniority, but the individual who had proven physical and tactical dominance over every other alpha in the formation. Challenges were not symbolic. They were fought with natural weaponry in front of the pack. The scars were worn openly, and the deepest scars conveyed the highest authority. What the intelligence files emphasized, underlined, bolded, and repeated across multiple classification levels was the Vraxen expansion record. Over the preceding 11 centuries, the Vraxen primacy had absorbed 47 star systems. In that time, they had encountered 6 spacefaring civilizations, 6 species that had built ships, discovered FTL, built colonies, developed cultures and governments and dreams of their own. Every encounter had followed the same arc. The Vraxen arrived. They assessed the species' military capability, and then they subjugated or destroyed them. There were no known cases of negotiated peace, no diplomatic precedent, no alliances, no treaties, no trade agreements. The Vraxen did not negotiate. They hunted. When the hunt was over, they absorbed what remained or left it as wreckage. The intelligence files gave names to 4 of the 6. The Cathali, a peaceful, spacefaring species that had attempted diplomatic first contact and been erased within 6 weeks. The Vassarai, a militaristic civilization that had fielded a combined fleet of over 200 warships and lasted 9 days. The Dromni, nomadic, fast, built for running, they tried to scatter, and the Vraxen had run them down over the course of 4 years, system by system, ship by ship, until the last Dromni vessel was boarded and stripped in a nameless drift between stars. The Oreshan, an ancient, slow-moving species that had simply refused to believe the Vraxen were real until the hunting packs entered orbit above their homeworld. The other 2 civilizations had no names in the files. Whatever they had called themselves was lost. The Vraxen had not kept records of their identities, only their locations, coordinates for systems that now bore Vraxen designation codes and Vraxen settlements. First contact for the Vraxen was the opening movement of a kill, and 42 of their ships had just entered our system. I should have been terrified. I was, in a way, the low, persistent fear that lives in the gut and doesn't go away when you breathe deeply or focus on your work. It's the fear that comes from arithmetic, 42 warships against 1. No reinforcements within jump distance. No one who even knew we were here, because we'd been running dark for 8 days and hadn't transmitted a status report since entering the system. But the basalt throne was dark, still invisible. The Vraxen didn't know we were here. We could wait them out, let them sweep the system, find nothing, and leave. We could file a contact report after the fact, flag the system as Vraxen active, and let Fleet Command decide the next move. That was what I assumed we'd do. Captain Adren Lear did not give the order to run. He also did not give the order to prepare for combat. He gave no orders at all for 3 hours. I learned later from the bridge crew what those 3 hours looked like from the command chair. Lear sat in his chair, the big, worn leather chair at the center of the bridge, the one with the armrest controls that let him access any station on the ship, and watched the tactical plot. His coffee went cold. He didn't drink it. Commander Cade, his executive officer, stood to his right, watching the same plot, occasionally glancing at the captain with an expression that I've been told was carefully controlled blankness. Cade knew what Lear was doing. He'd been briefed alongside the captain, months ago, in a room at Fleet Intelligence that Cade once described to me as having no windows and too many flags. The rest of the bridge crew waited. They were professionals. They'd been hand-selected for this ship, which I didn't know at the time, and they waited the way professionals wait, quietly, attentively, trusting the chain of command. On my display in Sensor Pit 2, the Vraxen flotilla moved through the system. They moved the way predators move. Not in a line, not in a column, not in any formation that suggested caution or defense. They fanned out, a wide, sweeping arc of fast ships spreading from the translation point and curving inward toward the system's core. Hunter-class vessels, lean and sharp-keeled, built for pursuit. I counted 31 of them as they spread across my display, each one holding station relative to the others with the unconscious precision of a wolf pack that has hunted together since birth. Behind them, heavier ships held in a loose picket line. Cruiser-mass vessels, broad-hulled, their thermal profiles bright with active sensors and charged weapons. They weren't hunting, they were blocking, cutting off the avenues of retreat that prey might use once the hunters flushed it from cover. And behind the picket line, at the formation center, hanging in the shadow of the system's outer asteroid belt, was the command ship. I ran mass estimates on the command ship 3 times because I didn't believe the first 2. She was close to 4 kilometers long, larger than the basalt throne, and her hull carried a thermal signature that said she was running hot. Every system active, weapons charged, sensors at full power. She was the center of the web, the Alpha's throne, and she radiated confidence the way a star radiates light, effortlessly in every direction, as a fundamental property of what she was. Chief Talcy stood at my shoulder as the formation developed on my display. She pointed at the spreading fan of Hunter-class ships. "Beat her line," she said quietly. The fast ships sweep forward and flush prey out of cover. The heavies behind them cut off retreat, and the command ship sits back and takes the kill when the prey has nowhere left to go. "They're hunting," I said. "They're always hunting, Vasek. That's the thing about the Vraxen. They don't have a peacetime posture and a wartime posture. They don't have a diplomatic formation and a combat formation. They have one way of moving through space, and this is it. What are they hunting here? There's nothing in this system except us," she said. "There's us. They can't know we're here." She shrugged, a small motion of the shoulders that conveyed years of experience with the gap between what should be true and what is. "Maybe not. Maybe they detected the translation signature when we entered the system 9 days ago. Maybe they've been tracking us for weeks from a long-range observation post we haven't found. Maybe they're sweeping every unclaimed system in the outer reaches as a matter of routine. It doesn't matter why they're here. They're here." The next 4 hours were the longest of my life to that point. The Vraxen beater line swept inward on a broad arc, their active sensors raking every planetary body, every asteroid cluster, every dust cloud and debris band in the system. They were thorough. They were patient. They covered every potential hiding place with the methodical intensity of a species that understood, at a genetic level, that thoroughness was the difference between eating and starving. The basalt throne sat in the shadow of Thessaly 7 and did nothing. I want to explain what that silence felt like, because it's the detail that haunts me still. Running dark in a gas giant's shadow is not a passive experience. It requires active effort, constant monitoring of your own emissions, constant adjustment of the passive radiators, constant vigilance against any system that might cycle on by automation or habit. The ship is alive, but it's alive the way a sleeping animal is alive, breathing shallow, heart rate low, every muscle still. The hum of the life support is the only sound. The emergency lighting turns every face the same washed-out amber. You speak in whispers not because you have to, sound doesn't carry in vacuum, but because the silence inside the ship creates its own pressure, its own gravity, and your voice feels too loud for the space it occupies. For 4 hours I sat in that silence and watched 42 warships look for me. The fear was specific and it was rational. These were not theoretical threats on a training simulator. These were Vraxan hunting ships crewed by a species that had extinguished 6 civilizations. The intelligence files included, in a classified annex that I had been required to read and then sign a non-disclosure form, a summary of what the Vraxan had done to the Cathali, a peaceful, spacefaring species that had attempted to make diplomatic first contact with a Vraxan ranging pack approximately 200 years ago. The Cathali had sent a delegation. Open channels, universal greeting protocols, gifts, gestures of peaceful intent. They had done everything right, everything the textbook said you should do when encountering an unknown civilization. They had been transparent, cooperative, and willing. The Vraxan had listened politely to the entire transmission, then destroyed the delegation's ship, tracked the signal back to its origin, and dismantled the Cathali's home system over the following 6 weeks. It wasn't war. War implies an exchange of force. This was a harvest. The Cathali no longer existed as a species. Their worlds were Vraxan territory now, their cities overgrown with whatever the Vraxan planted in them, their name a footnote in a classified intelligence file that a 23-year-old ensign had read and tried not to think about while sitting in the dark. What I couldn't reconcile, what I kept turning over hour after hour, as the Vraxan beater line swept closer, was the captain's inaction. We weren't running. We weren't fighting. We weren't even preparing to fight. The weapon stations were manned but cold. The gun crews sat at their consoles with their hands in their laps, watching boards that showed nothing because the weapon systems were powered down. The basalt throne's main battery, 8 turreted mass drivers, each one capable of accelerating a tungsten slug to 3% of light speed, sat silent in their housings, cold barrels pointed at nothing. We could have run. A Rampart-class dreadnought is not fast, but she's fast enough to reach a safe translation distance and jump out before a hunting formation can close the gap. We could have fought. The basalt throne outmassed every ship in that flotilla except the command vessel, and her armor was rated for sustained engagement against multiple capital-class opponents. We could have at least powered up the weapons and let the Vraxan know we had teeth, forced them to factor our bite into their calculations before they closed the final distance. Captain Lear did none of these things. He sat in his chair. He watched his plot. He waited. I remember looking around the sensor pit during those hours and trying to read the faces of my crewmates. Crossley was impassive, his thick features set in the blank expression of a man who had decided to trust the chain of command and had nothing else to say about it. Markov was focused on her signal processing. She was monitoring the Vraxan's subsonic communications, logging every harmonic, building a tonal database in real time, and if she was afraid, she had filed it in whatever internal compartment she kept for feelings that interfered with work. Talcy was watching me. I think she could see the fear on my face, because at one point during the 3rd hour she leaned over and said, very quietly, The captain knows what he's doing, Vasek. How do you know? I asked. Because I've served with 3 captains who didn't, and they all looked different from this. It wasn't reassuring in the way a reassurance is supposed to be. It was reassuring in the way that truth is sometimes reassuring, not because it makes you feel better, but because it tells you that someone in the room has a grip on what's real. I found out later, much later after the after-action reviews, the intelligence debriefs, the commendations, the classified reports, that Lear had been briefed on the Vraxen 6 months before we entered the outer reaches. Not a standard intelligence briefing. A dedicated 3-week analytical session at Fleet Intelligence Headquarters, where behavioral psychologists, evolutionary biologists, and combat modeling specialists had spent years building a predictive framework for Vraxen behavior. The conclusion of that 3-week session was distilled into a single sentence, buried on page 217 of a 300-page classified document. The Vraxen have never encountered a species that chose not to react. Every civilization the Vraxen had contacted did one of 3 things: flee, fight, or attempt to negotiate from a position of visible weakness. The Cathali had negotiated, the Vassarai had fought, the Dromni had fled, all 3 were gone. The Vraxen's entire tactical and psychological toolkit, their formations, their command doctrine, their instinctive read of any encounter, was calibrated to exploit one of those 3 responses. Prey runs and you chase it down. Prey fights and you overpower it. Prey submits and you accept the submission on your terms. What the Vraxen had never experienced in 1100 years of expansion, across 6 civilizations, across 47 star systems, was an entity that did none of those things. That sat, that watched, that gave nothing back. Captain Lear had been sent into the outer reaches to do nothing, and he was very good at it. The rest of the crew, or most of it, had been selected for the same capability, though none of us knew it at the time. The Basalt Thrones Company was filled with lifers, with veterans, with people like Talsi who had spent decades learning how to wait in the dark without cracking. The junior officers were the exception, not the rule. We were there to fill billets and to learn. Or perhaps we were there because someone at Fleet Intelligence had decided that the behavioral model worked better with a crew that wasn't entirely in on the plan. A ship that was genuinely calm because most of its people genuinely trusted what they were doing, anchored by a captain who carried the classified weight alone. I've never confirmed that theory, but it fits what I saw. I didn't know any of this at the time. I was a junior analyst in Sensor Pit 2, watching 42 predatory warships tighten the net around my position, and my captain wasn't moving. At 90 minutes from closest approach, the beater line adjusted. I saw it before the tactical AI flagged it. 2 Hunter-class ships on the far wing altered course by 8 degrees, curving their sweep toward Thessaly 7. Then 2 more. Then the entire near wing bent inward, 21 ships adjusting their vectors in a smooth, coordinated wave. "They've seen something," I said. Talsi was at my shoulder before I finished the sentence. She watched the adjustments propagate across the formation, her eyes tracing the curved trajectories on the display. "They haven't seen us," she said carefully. "They've detected the mass anomaly, the gravitational perturbation. 240 million tons of dreadnought sitting in a gas giant's well. At some point the math tells them something's here that shouldn't be. They don't know what, but they know where. Should we run?" She looked at me with an expression I would later come to recognize as the face veteran enlisted personnel make when a junior officer is about to learn something they can't be told. "That's the captain's call." I opened the hardline. Sensor 2 to bridge. Beater line is adjusting. 21 Hunter-class ships have altered course toward Thessaly 7, converging on our orbital position. Estimate closest approach in 94 minutes at current acceleration. Captain Lear's voice came through as though he were reading a weather report. "Confirmed. Continue passive watch." That was all. No additional orders, no change in ship's posture. The Vraxen came on. They came in a pattern the intelligence files called a convergent stalk. Not a direct approach, but a spiraling, tightening gyre, each ship taking a slightly different angle of advance, covering each other's sensor blind spots, ensuring that whatever sat at the center of their spiral had no avenue of escape they hadn't already mapped. It was the three-dimensional equivalent of wolves circling a downed elk. Patient, coordinated, utterly confident. Except these wolves were 200 meters long and carried particle lances that could core through a mountain. I watched them tighten the spiral from my console, each ship's trajectory a curved line on the display, the lines weaving around each other in a pattern that looked almost organic, like the strands of a net being drawn closed. The gaps between ships shrank. The angle of approach steepened. The spiral narrowed. At 60 minutes, the heavier Vraxan ships began to move. The picket line contracted toward Thessaly 7, tightening around the system like a fist closing. The cruiser-mass vessels advanced in pairs, their weapons still hot, their active sensors overlapping to create a continuous detection field. Behind them, the command ship advanced for the first time, drifting forward out of the asteroid belt's shadow with a ponderous, gravitational certainty that communicated everything about its confidence. The Prime Alpha was coming to observe the kill. At 45 minutes, Markov spoke for the first time in over an hour. "I'm getting subsonic on the passive array. Vraxan intership communication. Heavy traffic." "Translate," Talsi said. "I can't, it's compressed tonal, not language as we'd recognize it, but the AI is giving me emotional metadata." She looked at her display. "Dominant register is anticipation, coordinated intent. The AI's best analog is a hunting call." They were calling to each other. 42 ships, singing the frequency of the hunt, harmonizing across a formation that stretched tens of thousands of kilometers. Not words, not commands. Something older than language, older than culture, the subsonic pulse of a predator species coordinating around located prey. They were singing because they thought they'd found something to kill. Crossley said, without looking up from his console, "For what it's worth, I've checked the escape vectors. If we go to full power now, we can reach translation distance in 11 minutes. The closest Vraxan hunter is 17 minutes out at their maximum intercept speed." Talsi shook her head. "That analysis assumes they don't have sprint capability we haven't observed yet, and it assumes we can power up from dark to full drive in under 90 seconds, which the engineering manual says we can, but I've never seen tested in a real-world scenario." She paused. "But that's not why we're not running." "Then why?" I asked. "Because the captain didn't come out here to run, Vasek." The weight of that sentence settled over the sensor pit like a physical thing. I felt it in my chest, the realization, still forming, that this deployment wasn't what I'd been told it was. That the survey mission was a cover, or at least a secondary objective. That someone, somewhere in the chain of command, had placed a Rampart-class dreadnought in the outer reaches on purpose, in the path of a Vraxan ranging pack, and had given its captain very specific orders about what to do when the pack arrived. I was bait, the ship was bait, and the captain was the hunter. At 30 minutes, the first Hunter-class ships entered Thessaly 7's upper radiation belt. Their active sensors pounded the gas giant's interference layer, raw electromagnetic force, broad spectrum, cutting through the planet's noise like a searchlight through fog. The passive array in sensor pit 2 rattled with the incoming energy. Crossley winced and adjusted his filters. "They're burning through the interference," he said. "Brute force, flooding every frequency and looking for the returns that don't match the planet's natural signature." "How long until they resolve us?" I asked. He ran the numbers, his fingers moving across the console with the automatic speed of a man who'd been doing the same calculation on different ships for 20 years. "At this output, 15 minutes, maybe 20 if the ammonia storms cooperate and shift between us." 15 minutes. I looked at the hardline phone on the console. I looked at Talsi. She was watching her display with the same steady expression she'd worn for the past 4 hours. I wanted to pick up the phone and ask the captain what the plan was. I wanted to hear someone say that we were going to do something, anything, before those ships resolved our hull and decided what to do about it. I wanted the waiting to end. But I was a junior officer on my first deployment, and the chief was calm, and the captain had given orders, and those orders were to watch and log and stay silent. So I sat at my console and I watched and I logged and I stayed silent, and the fear sat in my stomach like a cold stone, and the Vraxen came closer. I looked at the hardline. I looked at Talcy. She was watching her display with the same steady expression she'd worn for the past 4 hours, and I realized in that moment that she wasn't waiting for orders. She was waiting for the captain to do the thing he'd come here to do. She knew. She'd known since the Vraxen arrived. Maybe she'd known since we left port. I was sweating. The pit's temperature hadn't changed, life support held it at a constant 19 degrees, but my uniform was damp under the arms and across the small of my back. I was 23 years old, and 42 warships were closing on my position with the patient, organized intent of a species that had never lost a first contact. At 19 minutes, the lead Hunter-class ships cleared the upper radiation belt and entered the gas giant's visual shadow. Thessaly 7's shadow is not a hard edge. It's a gradient, the star's light bending and diffusing through 100,000 kilometers of turbulent atmosphere, dimming by degrees until the darkness is nearly complete. The Vraxen ships emerged from that gradient like shapes surfacing from deep water, dark silhouettes resolving against the rust-amber glow of the planet's storms. They were beautiful in the way that dangerous things are often beautiful. The Hunter-class hull was a swept-forward design, segmented, with a body plan that echoed the chitinous plating of the species that built it. Each ship looked like a living thing, a predator made of metal and composite, all angles and edges, with weapons mounted on articulated pylons that tracked independently of the hull, sweeping side to side like limbs testing the air for scent. Their running lights were amber, the color of Vraxiscor's sun, I later learned, and they pulsed in a rhythm that matched the subsonic hunting frequency on the comm channels. There were 19 of them now, with more arriving behind. They formed a loose ring around the region of space where their gravimetric sensors had localized the mass anomaly, which was, of course, precisely where we sat. Talcy said very quietly, "They can see us." I checked my display. She was right. At 12,000 kilometers, through the thinning interference of the radiation belt's inner edge, the Vraxen high-resolution active sensors were resolving returns consistent with a solid metallic object. Not a detailed image, not yet, but enough to know that what they were looking at wasn't an asteroid. The Vraxen reaction was immediate. The loose ring tightened. Ships that had been approaching at a cautious stalk surged forward, their drives flaring as they accelerated into close formation. Weapons pylons that had been tracking passively snapped forward into attack orientation, the universal gesture of a predator committing to the strike. The convergent stalk became a convergent sprint. And then it stopped. All of it, every ship, the entire ring frozen. I watched it happen on my display. One moment the Vraxen hunters were closing fast, coordinated, committed. The next they stopped. Not a gradual deceleration, not a tactical pause to reassess. A full stop. 19 ships perfectly still, drives dark, weapons trained on our position but no longer advancing. "Chief," I said. Talcy's eyes were locked on the display. "They see the hull." I understood. At 12,000 kilometers, the Vraxen sensors were no longer looking at a mass anomaly. They were looking at the ISV basalt throne, 2.7 kilometers of angular, armored, weaponized dreadnought hull sitting in the shadow of a gas giant, running dark, silent, unmoving, not fleeing, not fighting, not transmitting a distress signal or a surrender offer or a diplomatic greeting, not doing anything at all. Just sitting there, in the dark, looking back. I tried to imagine what the Vraxen sensor operators were seeing. Their high-resolution active returns would have been painting a picture now. The flat, angular planes of the Rampart-class hull, the layered armor plating, the turret housings that held the mass drivers, the antenna farms and sensor domes that studded the dorsal and ventral surfaces. They would have seen the size. A Vraxan Hunter-class ship was 200 meters long. The basalt throne was more than 13 times that length. They would have seen the armor thickness, 3 meters of composite plate in places, designed to absorb and dissipate kinetic impacts that would core through a Hunter-class hull like a round through paper. They would have seen the weapons, the 8 main turrets, the 42-point defense clusters, the missile bays, the kinetic launch rails, the broadside emplacements, all of them cold, all of them silent, all of them aimed at nothing. And they would have seen that none of it was running. The ship was dark. It had been dark when they entered the system. It had been dark when they began the sweep. It had been dark when they formed the ring. It was still dark. Whatever this thing was, it had watched them come and had not reacted. For a predator species, that was the message. The subsonic channels, the Vraxan intership communication that Markov had been monitoring, changed character instantly. The hunting frequency vanished. In its place, the tactical AI registered a sharp, fragmented burst of high-amplitude tonal traffic, dozens of ships transmitting simultaneously, their harmonics overlapping, the emotional metadata flickering through registers faster than the AI could categorize. Markov read the analysis as it scrolled. Anticipation is gone. Dominant register is. The AI's flagging it as novel. No direct match in the Vraxan behavioral database. She paused. Closest analog is threat recognition. The harmonic pattern they produce when they encounter something that might be dangerous. 42 ships, a species that had never lost a first contact. And for the first time in recorded history, the Vraxan were looking at something, and the word that fit was might. On the bridge, I learned this afterward, from the bridge crew, from the official record, from Captain Lear himself during a conversation years later. The captain set down his cold coffee cup and placed both hands on the armrests of his chair. "All stations," he said, "status change." The bridge straightened. Commander Cade moved to his station. Lieutenant Commander Hale's voice came over the tactical net, clear and controlled. "All stations, this is TOC. Prepare for system activation. This is not a drill. Weapon stations remain cold. Repeat, weapon stations remain cold. All sensor, communications, navigation, and fire control tracking systems to full active on my mark." I looked at Talcy. She was smiling, not a broad smile, not a grin, but a small, private expression, the kind that surfaces when something you've been waiting for finally arrives. "What's happening?" I asked. "The captain's going to introduce himself." Hale's voice, "All stations, mark." The ISV Basalt Throne woke up. I have tried in the 31 years since to describe what it felt like from the inside. The best I've managed is this. Imagine sitting in a room that has been dark for 8 days. The darkness is so complete that you have almost forgotten the room has walls, has dimensions, has a shape. You've adapted to the silence, the stillness, the sense of being nowhere. And then someone turns on every light, opens every shutter, starts every engine all at once, and the room is enormous, bigger than you remembered, bigger than you imagined, and it has been here, all around you this entire time. The Basalt Throne sensor arrays went active. All 46 of them, every dish, every phased array panel, every antenna cluster on the hull. They painted the system in electromagnetic radiation across every frequency band humanity had learned to use, from long-wave radio to high-energy gamma, a wall of energy expanding outward at light speed. Her navigational transponder fired for the first time in 8 days, broadcasting her name, her class, her registry, her flag, on the standard first contact identification frequency. ISV Basalt Throne, Rampart-class Dreadnought, Terran Fleet, United Sol Authority. Her communications suite opened, 15,000 discrete channels, each one carrying a formatted identification package. each one repeating the same message in the mathematical language protocols that the fleet's first contact division had developed for exactly this scenario. Her navigation lights came on, a constellation of white and amber markers along the hull, outlining her shape against the darkness, turning the basalt throne from a shadow into a solid, visible, physical presence. And her targeting systems went active. Not aimed, not locked, active. Every fire control radar, every LiDAR tracking system, every ballistic prediction suite, every point defense network, every countermeasure sensor, all of it humming to life simultaneously. The Vraxen would see it on their instruments as a sudden, massive bloom of targeting-grade radiation, the electronic signature of a warship that has just turned on every system designed to find, track, and kill other warships. But the Basalt Throne did not fire. She didn't lock on. She didn't train her guns. She didn't cycle her weapons or charge her mass drivers or deploy her kinetic launch rails. She turned on everything she had, every system, every sensor, every capability, and let the Vraxen see what they had been standing next to for the past 6 hours. The message required no translation. In the language of predators, a language the Vraxen understood at a level deeper than culture, deeper than doctrine, deeper than thought, the message was absolute. I have been here the entire time. I watched you enter the system. I watched you form the sweep. I watched you close the ring. I let you approach. I chose to let you come this close, and now I am showing you what I am. Not because you forced me, not because I'm afraid, because I choose to. The effect on the Vraxen fleet was not something I will forget if I live another 100 years. The ring shattered, not in the controlled fashion of a military disengagement, not a peel-off, not a withdrawal under fire drill, not a coordinated retreat to pre-planned rally points. The ring broke apart the way glass breaks, all at once, along lines of fracture no one had predicted. Ships that had been holding formation with the iron discipline of apex predators fired maneuvering thrusters in random directions, each vessel reacting on its own instinct, its crew's individual panic overriding the collective coordination that had held the formation together. Some pulled straight back. Some banked hard to port or starboard. 2 ships on the near side of the ring actually collided, a glancing impact, hull plates grinding, composite armor sheeting away in bright flakes, sparks scattering into the void before separating and accelerating apart. The subsonic channels went beyond anything the tactical AI had a framework for. The emotional metadata display, which had been cycling through recognizable Vraxen registers for the past 5 hours, displayed a single word: novel. The harmonic pattern didn't match anything in the database. Not fear, not aggression, not submission, not retreat. Something the Vraxen had never broadcast because they had never felt what they were feeling now. Chief Talcy watched the same readout. She said, "That's not a command harmonic. They're not coordinating. They're warning each other." "Warning of what?" Crossley asked from his station. "Presence," she said. "Proximity, the thing in the dark that they thought was prey." I watched the heavy ships react next, the picket line cruisers, the armored escorts, the broad-hulled support vessels. They were slower to break than the Hunter-class ships, their crews more experienced, their captains older and harder to rattle. But they broke. One by one, in a cascading wave that spread from the ships closest to us outward to the ships farthest away, the heavy formation came apart. Ships reversed course. Ships that had been contracting the picket opened it, creating gaps, turning a wall into a sieve, opening avenues of retreat that hadn't existed a minute earlier. The command ship was last. I focused my sensor suite on her, that enormous 4-kilometer hull at the formation's heart, the throne of Prime Alpha Cassivector, the seat of authority for a species that had built an empire on the principle that authority belonged to the strongest predator in the room. She was the largest warship I had ever seen, and I have not seen a larger one since. Her hull was darker than the Hunter-class ships, a deep, matte black, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, as though the ship itself had been designed to look like a hole cut in the star field. Weapons emplacement studded her flanks in dense clusters, more armament on one broadside than the entire combined firepower of some of the species the Vraxen had destroyed. She had been advancing since the hunt began. She had never paused, never adjusted course, never shown a moment's uncertainty. The command ship of a Vraxen flotilla does not hesitate, because the Prime Alpha does not hesitate. To waver is to invite challenge. To show uncertainty is to lose the pack's loyalty. The scars on a Prime Alpha's body are proof that hesitation has been beaten out of them. The command ship hesitated. It was brief, 4 seconds, maybe 5, but it was there. The drives flickered. The course drifted, a fraction of a degree off vector, corrected, drifted again, corrected again. On the subsonic channels, a single deep harmonic pulsed from the command ship, a frequency so low that the tactical AI had to amplify it 600 times before it registered on my headset. It sounded like a breath being held. Then the command ship's main drives fired at full reverse thrust. She began to decelerate. Captain Lear spoke. Comms open a channel. Standard first contact protocol, text-only transmission. Identify us, state our intent, formal register. Lieutenant Pava at the communication station. Channel open, Captain. Transmitting identification and intent package on all standard frequencies. The message went out. I read it later in the official record. From ISV Basalt Throne, Rampart-class Dreadnought Terran Fleet, United Sol Authority. To Unidentified Flotilla Command. This vessel is conducting a survey patrol in unclaimed space. We carry no hostile intent. We are prepared to establish formal communication at your discretion. We will hold position. Formal, measured, even polite. The kind of message you send when you have nothing to prove and all the time in the world. The Vraxen did not respond for 11 minutes. In that time, the flotilla's coherence continued to degrade. The Hunter-class ships had pulled back to 40,000 kilometers, well beyond engagement range, well beyond the distance at which a predator commits to a kill. The heavy ships had retreated further. Only the command ship remained at anything resembling proximity, and she was decelerating hard, her vast hull shuddering under the sustained reverse burn. In Sensor Pit 2, we waited. Talcy had pulled up the first contact protocol handbook on her secondary display, and was scrolling through it with the calm focus of someone who had always suspected she'd need it and wanted to be ready. Markov was recording everything, every sensor return, every subsonic harmonic, every electromagnetic emission from the Vraxen flotilla, building the most detailed real-time record of Vraxen fleet behavior that human intelligence had ever obtained. Crossley had quietly pulled up the weapons readiness display, not because he expected the captain to change his mind, but because old habits die hard and he wanted to know the numbers. I watched the command ship. She was still decelerating, still drifting toward us, but more slowly now, her velocity bleeding off under sustained reverse thrust. On the subsonic channels, the Vraxen intership traffic had dropped to almost nothing. The frantic burst of transmissions that had followed the Basalt Throne's activation had given way to a deep, low-frequency hum, a single sustained tone, emanating from the command ship, that the tactical AI classified as a pack-hold harmonic. The Alpha telling the pack to stop, to wait, to hold position while the Alpha assessed. I remember thinking, the Prime Alpha is doing exactly what Captain Lear did, sitting, watching, deciding, two predators both still, each one waiting for the other to commit. When the response came, it arrived not as text but as a structured tonal sequence, a formal Vraxen diplomatic communication, compressed and layered, the subsonic harmonics carrying emotional metadata beneath the surface content. The tactical AI translated it in real time. 3 elements. First, identification. The flotilla was the 9th ranging pack of the Vraxen primacy, under the authority of Prime Alpha Cassavector. Second, acknowledgement. The 9th ranging pack acknowledged the presence of the Terran vessel and its stated intent. Third, a single compound harmonic that the AI flagged with the highest priority marker in its classification system. The closest translation the system could produce was two concepts fused into a single tonal phrase. The territory is recognized. Chief Talcy read the translation on her display and sat down. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Crossley and Markov both looked over at her, waiting. Then she said, almost to herself, "They've never said that to anyone in 1100 years." I didn't fully understand. Not then, not at 23, not with the adrenaline still draining from my system and my hands still shaking on the console. But Talcy understood, and Captain Lear understood, and the intelligence analysts who spent the next 3 years dissecting this encounter understood. The Vraxen had 47 systems, 6 subjugated species, 1100 years of expansion built on a single, unbroken axiom. The Vraxen were the apex. Everything else was beneath them. That wasn't just a belief. It was their biology, their psychology, their command hierarchy, their theology, their identity. To be Vraxen was to be the thing at the top. And in 5 words, the territory is recognized. Prime Alpha Cassivector had done something no Vraxen leader had done in the recorded history of their civilization. Acknowledged a peer. Not a surrender, not a submission, not even a truce, a recognition. One predator looking across the dark at another predator and understanding at the level where instinct runs deeper than thought that this was not prey. The Vraxen withdrew. Not quickly. Speed would have been flight, and the Vraxen do not flee. They withdrew with the deliberate, controlled precision of a species that understood what it was doing and wanted the universe to know that the choice was theirs. The Hunter-class ships reassembled first, falling back into their swept formation and accelerating toward the system boundary in tight order. The heavy ships followed, closing ranks around the command ship, forming a protective shell that the Vraxen reserved for one circumstance only, when the Prime Alpha had decided that the pack was leaving. The command ship turned last. Her massive hull rotated away from Thessaly 7 with a slowness that I initially read as reluctance but later understood as protocol. The Prime Alpha never turns away quickly, because to turn quickly is to admit urgency, and the Vraxen do not admit urgency. I watched them go on my display. 42 icons receding toward the system's outer boundary, their formation tight and closed, their weapons dark, their transponders silent. No one on the basalt throne spoke until the last Vraxen ship crossed the system edge and translated to FTL. The signatures flared brief gravitational spikes and vanished, one by one, until the display was empty. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the previous 8 days. That silence had been discipline, the ship holding its breath, staying invisible, maintaining the dark. This silence was the aftermath. The crew sat at their stations and looked at empty displays and tried to process what had just happened. Crossley leaned back in his chair and stared at the overhead. Markov saved her tonal database every Vraxen harmonic from the past 6 hours, cataloged and time-stamped, and closed her console with a quiet click. Talcy was the first to move. She stood up, crossed the pit to the hardline, and reported to TOC in a voice that was entirely steady. Sensor 2. All contacts have left the system. No residual signatures. No trailing elements. The system is clear. There was a pause. Then Hale confirmed, "Good work, Sensor 2." I sat at my station and felt the adrenaline ebb out of my body like water out of a cracked hull. My hands were trembling. My jaw ached from how long I'd been clenching it. I took my hands off the console and set them in my lap and watched them shake and waited for them to stop. Talcy put a hand on my shoulder as she walked past. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Captain Lear stood up from his chair on the bridge. He looked at the bridge crew, the men and women who had sat with him in the dark for 8 days, who had watched 42 ships close on their position without flinching, who had obeyed the hardest order a warship captain can give, which is to do nothing when every instinct says to act. He said, "Well done," nothing else. No speech, no debrief, no summary of what they'd accomplished. Then he walked off the bridge to get fresh coffee. I have had 31 years to think about what happened in that system. I retired from the fleet at 54 with the rank of commander. I served on 11 ships across 3 theaters and saw combat twice, small engagements, border frictions, the kind of brief and forgettable violence that punctuates long careers. Neither engagement taught me a fraction of what those hours in Thessaly 7's shadow taught me. The encounter changed things, not dramatically, not overnight, but in the deep, structural way that tectonic shifts change the shape of a continent. The intelligence community spent 3 years analyzing every second of our sensor recordings. The behavioral psychologists rewrote their models. The diplomatic corps built an entire first contact doctrine around what Captain Lear had done, codifying his instinct into protocol. When encountering a predator-evolved civilization, do not flee, do not threaten, do not negotiate. Be still, be visible. Let them come to their own conclusion. Not every officer agreed. There were admirals who argued that we'd been lucky, that a different Prime Alpha would have attacked, that the Vraxen's hesitation was a fluke of individual temperament rather than a species-level response. Lear listened to those arguments at the review board and said nothing. He'd made his decision in the chair. The results spoke for themselves. The Vraxen primacy and the United Sol Authority have maintained formal diplomatic relations for 28 years now. The relationship is not warm, it is not friendly. The Vraxen do not do warm or friendly, and neither, when it matters, do we. But it holds. The framework rests on the foundation Cassavector laid down. The territory is recognized. 2 predators sharing a border, each aware of what the other is. There have been incidents, border probes, sensor sweeps that pushed too close, a handful of tense standoffs in contested drift zones, but no shots fired. Not once. The treaty has held because it's built on something stronger than politics or economics or mutual benefit. It's built on recognition. The Vraxen know what we are. We know what they are. And neither of us has blinked. The intelligence analysts have a theory. I've read the papers, the academic work, the classified behavioral models about why it worked. The theory says that predator species, true apex predators, have a recognition instinct that prey species don't. When a predator encounters something that doesn't run, doesn't fight, doesn't submit, something that simply sits and watches and gives nothing, the predator's threat assessment system does not interpret this as weakness. It interprets it as dominance. Because in the predator's world, the only animal that doesn't react is the one that doesn't need to. The Vraxen had never encountered that. In 11 centuries across 6 civilizations, no species had ever sat still in the dark and let the Vraxen come. No one had ever said through their silence, "I see you. I know what you are. I've been watching you longer than you've been watching me, and I am not concerned." I asked Captain Lear once, years later, at a fleet retirement ceremony. He was leaving, I was staying in, what he would have done if the Vraxen hadn't stopped. If the convergence stalk had become a convergence kill. If 42 ships had committed to the attack instead of breaking formation. He looked at me with those same unhurried eyes, the ones that hadn't wavered through 8 hours of a hunting fleet closing on his position. "Then I'd have shown them what the guns do," he said, "but I didn't think it would come to that." Why not? Because they're predators, Torin, real ones. And a real predator is the only thing in the universe that understands what it means to be still. He finished his drink and went home. He died 4 years later, his heart, not combat, and the fleet named a sensor station after him. A small one at the edge of the outer reaches, where the patrols go out into the dark. I think about him sometimes, on quiet nights when the house is still, and the windows are dark, and there's nothing to do but sit and listen to the silence. I think about the basalt throne, 2.7 kilometers of blocky, angular, armored hull, invisible in the shadow of a rust-colored giant, running dark, saying nothing, doing nothing at all. And I think about how that nothing was the loudest thing, the galaxy had ever heard.